This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. One of the joys of this podcast is that I get to scratch my itch. Today on my show is a guest who knows a lot about subjects that I have a deep interest in. This would be the Vietnam War and some of the key actors like the President Lyndon Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. Brian has written many books on the subject and the men. Definitely worth checking out. He is a history professor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And one of the great things about this podcast, when I have that itch, is that I just reach out to people directly and say, hey, will you talk to me? Can I have you on? Brian agreed. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Brian VanDeMark. You have got your newest book on the Vietnam War, a new take on it. You've got a book on LBJ. You've got a book on McNamara. You're a guy that spent a lot of time in these subjects. Now, how did you get going down this particular path as a historian?
I think a lot has to do with what we mentioned just a moment ago, which is I was born in 1960, grew up in the 60s and early 70s. The event that dominated American society and politics was the Vietnam War. The controversy, the polarization, the animosity was so palpable. I was touched by that. I was impressed by that. I had friends in my neighborhood who had older brothers who had to make choices between serving or avoiding the draft. So it was a very real and vivid issue in America during the years that I was growing up. As I got older, that interest remained with me. I hoped to be able to approach it in a way which was looking at it from a broad point of view and trying to see things in 360 degrees and not being blinded by partisanship to the point where you can't see the other side of the coin. And it remains an important issue in American society and history. I don't think the country's ever recovered from the divisions created by the war. I think to a significant degree, a lot of what we see today is a variation on that theme. If you look at the long sweep of American history, aside from the American Civil War, which was the big daddy, the Vietnam War was probably the most traumatic and divisive issue in all of American history.
You're speaking to somebody, you know my age now. I said I was born in 1968, and I'm sure you saw when we originally caught up with each other, I'm in Saigon tonight. I've been living here primarily since 2013. I'm not sure exactly how a guy who was born on the Quantico Naval Marine Base, whose father was a Navy dentist, who one of our good friends who lived down the street ended up being the naval attaché for Hong Kong. Growing up high school, the Reagan era, patriotic America, Rambo was right, all that kind of stuff. There's guys still in Vietnam. And I had the perspective of like, okay, the new memorial in DC. You know, I think most Americans, if they think about it for more than a few seconds, can probably tell you that 58,000 Americans died. As a guy living in Vietnam, a guy who never expected to be here. I don't know if there's anything you want to ask me out of the gate, but I think for me, the two biggest things, just to jump into the deep end, and we can backfill in and go all around. But I think for me, as an American, the two biggest things, first, the total deaths, the total number of Vietnamese that died. Those numbers are just something that I had no perspective on at all. I think in the fog of war, McNamara says 3.6 million. Okay, it could be 4 million. It could be 2 million. It's millions. I had no perspective on that at all. So that's one issue. The second issue, which came from Halberstam's book, I believe, is where I first saw the thought. This is after I came here and after I'm living here, was the idea that Ho Chi Minh could put on the battlefield every year 200,000 new 18-year-olds, which meant all of the American leaders had to have known we were fighting the birth rate from the get-go. which, I mean, you can take it back to Graham Greene's The Quiet American in the 50s. And then you come here, and I don't know if you've been here or not, but then you come here and you live here, and it's like, boy, it's an entirely different punch to the gut than the typical American probably has. And I'm sure with your experience, you can probably rustle around in what's going on inside my mind already.
Well, I mean, the points you make are compelling ones. I think for Americans, legacy of the war is a very different proposition than it is for Vietnamese. To be blunt about it, we lost and they won. I think that affects how you view a conflict in hindsight. Americans are usually very familiar with their own history, but not particularly familiar with other countries' histories. The war inflicted such a wound on American society, killed, as you pointed out, nearly 60,000 American soldiers and wounded hundreds of thousands. But that was a drop in the bucket compared to its impact in terms of human lives in Vietnam. It's just that we weren't attuned to that or aware of that. I think in the case of the Vietnamese, because they won, the sting of the costs of the war are real, but they don't have the wallop that human life lost in pursuit of a failed war tends to produce. The Vietnamese population today, as you know, Mike, is very young. The large majority of Vietnamese have no lived experience of that war. And for them, Americans are a business opportunity, someone who's bringing money into the economy, and they're friendly, open, optimistic people that they find very engaging. So I think the burden of the war on the Vietnamese in some respects are paradoxically fewer, even though the human cost was so much greater.
You're right about the age. I think I've seen different quotes, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of the country is under the age of 35. So yes, they were all born after the war, which is an amazing baby boom that took place after the war. I mean, it's phenomenal. I'll add something also to your point about their views towards Americans. I've not had one person say one crass thing towards me in all this time. Nothing. It's just an amazing curiosity. It's an amazing, I want to know you. It's an amazing friendliness. They do have that, I feel, and maybe some Vietnamese are listening and they'll want to kick my butt and say, this is not accurate. This is just my perspective. I feel like they also have a deep respect for the Japanese who did occupy Vietnam for a stretch in World War II. But, they don't have the affection for the Chinese. They might not say that in public, but they do not have the affection for Chinese. They don't have the affection for the French, but they really do for Americans, which is really, as you say, paradoxical in a sense. How in the world, after we do all that, can they have such a nice view on us? And I think it's more than just business. You're right, it's business, but I think it's more than that.
Well, I think the point you made about their attitude toward the Chinese is spot on, and it's quite revealing. Because China is such a rapidly growing economic and potentially military power, and they are next door to the Vietnamese have traditionally, historically been deeply ambivalent toward the Chinese. One of the paradoxes of our involvement in China was that our fear throughout much of the war was that the North Vietnamese were essentially taking marching orders from Beijing, which was absurd if you really understand Vietnamese history. Even Ho and the leaders in the Politburo in Hanoi during the war were very ambivalent about cooperation with the Chinese. And I think one of the primary reasons that the North Vietnamese were so concerned about the American military involvement in Vietnam was that if they invaded North Vietnam, that would force the North Vietnamese to ask for the Chinese to come in order to cope with the American presence that had occurred in Korea. And the last thing Ho wanted was for the Chinese to show up and stay for another couple of hundred years. That helps you understand why their friendliness toward the Americans is influenced to some degree by our ability to offset the looming presence of China. But I think, too, the American presence there was arguably, and this is debatable, wasn't nearly as long-term as China's or as heavy-handed as the French. Our presence was heavy in the South, but it was fairly temporary.
Yes, that's a great way to say it, especially for, the China situation we just stated, but I think people listening, if they're not aware, and I've got plenty of French friends, probably French listeners, but France did show up in Vietnam on several occasions and was up to no good, to say the least.
And they're long-term, too.
Yeah. Just a simple thing, too, just a little factoid that people might find interesting. When the French controlled Vietnam, they did not give the Vietnamese places to bury their dead. The French said, go bury your dead in the rice fields. So the Vietnamese did. And so these days you can travel and see the elevated coffins in the rice fields.
Quite revealing, Mike. It also illustrates I don't know, either their insensitivity or ignorance of Vietnamese culture, because as you have learned, the ancestry worship, or at least the recognition of continuity across generations within families, are of fundamental importance of Vietnamese culture. And that French reaction is doing irreparable damage to respect for that kind of thing.
There's so many issues, as you lay it out at the beginning, traumatic on all fronts for a long period of time. I can say today, everything beyond COVID, everything seems to be going in a pretty decent, nice direction. I think it's a pretty amazing place. Let me take it back to, though, your descriptions of the culture and how people did not understand the culture and whatnot. So here we have we could pick a place to start. We could start with Truman. We could start with Eisenhower. But we start with JFK coming in, and he brings in McNamara. And my understanding is McNamara took the job, as long as he could bring in a bunch of, quote, best and brightest with him. But how in the world, when those folks showed up and started to, and of course, things did not really elevate, and we'll get into this, did not elevate as much, of course, until LBJ. But how did the early incarnations, when McNamara came in and they start looking at Vietnam, how did they misunderstand everything so early on? How did they not have the perspective that they could have been reading about in just something simple like The Quiet American? How did they not have that when they came in?
Well, I think part of this, that you and I and most human beings tend to view an event exclusively through the prism of the aftermath. Read back into our early involvement in Vietnam, all the consequences that played out subsequent to that. The point I want to convey is in the early 1960s, particularly from 61 through, I would say, the spring of 63, Vietnam, frankly, wasn't of very great importance or a priority to the Kennedy administration. It blows up in terms of being a significant issue in the summer and fall of 1963, and then we're off to the races. And I make this point throughout the book, when you're Secretary of Defense or President of the United States or Secretary of State, you are constantly juggling a lot of different balls, and you're focusing on the ones that are of most pressing significance from day to day, which discourages you, frankly, I think, from looking into an issue in great depth from a distance, because you're not going to begin thinking about it until it's right in your face. I don't think it excuses their ignorance of Vietnam in the early Kennedy years, but it helps understand why they were so appallingly unprepared to really sensitively and knowledgeably deal with that issue when it exploded in the summer of 1963.
Let me play devil's advocate and throw an argument out there that you might throw down the hill fast. But what if they did have this understanding? What if they did have the understanding that Graham Greene was writing about in the 50s, saying, when you Americans leave, when you leave, because you will leave, those rice fields and those oxen will still be out there. They've been here for thousands of years. They're going to be here long after you're gone. What if our leaders did have that understanding? Is that a possibility?
I think that it's more likely American leadership would have that understanding after a failed trauma like the Vietnam War rather than before it. I think Greene is onto a lot of fundamental truth, but never forget he was British. This isn't an American writing this story. America's self-awareness in the context that Greene describes it is quite limited in the era between the end of World War II and the heating up of the Vietnam War. Remember, this is the zenith of American optimism and confidence in our ability to fix problems, solve problems, lead the free world. And the United States and its people have never suffered from a lack of self-confidence when it comes to dealing with problems. And I think Greene, he's writing about the Americans in Vietnam very sensitively and perceptively, but he's doing it from the post-colonial perspective of a member of a failed empire. He's sensitive to the limits of power and the dangers of hubris because Britain has traveled that road, been there and done that. The Americans hadn't traveled that road in the 50s and 60s. They're still at the start of that road. And again, it doesn't excuse our lack of awareness and sensitivity to Vietnamese culture, but it does go a long way toward explaining why we paid precious little attention to what we should have been exploring in much greater depth, and why it's having a self-awareness of limits is always very useful for human beings. The problem is you're usually less likely to have that self-awareness when you're on a roll.
Let me keep it in that 1963 time period. I don't know the exact date, but McNamara has said this, that if JFK was not assassinated, that things in the 1960s in respect to Vietnam, he believes, would have unfolded differently. I think other people share that view, even people on the other side of the aisle. For example, I think it was in 1963 that JFK, maybe 62, 63, I think, JFK met with MacArthur, and MacArthur famously told him, no land wars in Asia, just don't do it. Apparently, they got along well. JFK said something to the effect that, look, the people, I guess, the Pentagon, those people, you're going to have to convince, how did he say it? You're going to have to convince those people to convince me, meaning he just was really respecting MacArthur's view. I guess what I'm getting at is there had to have been, before LBJ came in, there definitely had to have been points of view that were saying, you're giving a perspective of like, hey, hold on. In hindsight, Brian and Mike, us too, we can look back and analyze it. But there were some people contemporary to the events that were saying, hey, we might not want to do this.
And I think, too, people whose experience taught them the wisdom of not involving the United States in a land war in Asia like MacArthur, that's a very powerful testimony. But we should never forget that the decision maker in the American constitutional system is the President of the United States, who is an elected political leader. Because of that, they are perpetually sensitive to public opinion and the consequences of choices in terms of support for a particular policy or a leader when it comes to election or re-election. Kennedy was no different from Eisenhower or Johnson or Lincoln or Roosevelt in that regard. My opinion about the Kennedy issue related to what would have happened had he lived, the short answer is we will never know. That's the most honest answer that anyone can give you. I think Kennedy, like Johnson, was sensitive to the domestic political repercussions of walking away from our commitment in Vietnam. I do think the difference here is that Kennedy had experienced war up close and personal as it really is. And what that taught him was that the plan almost never goes according to plan and that people get hurt in a war. I think that sensitized him to the risks and costs of deeper military involvement in Vietnam. And in that respect, to the degree that he was sensitive above all else to that, compared to Johnson, for whom the consequences of Vietnam were primarily political rather than personal, so to speak. Johnson had no felt experience with war as it really is. I don't think he had sensitivity to what can go wrong in a war in the way that Kennedy did. And I think that therefore made Johnson less cautious about stepping off the cliff and jumping down into that big hole. He wasn't sensitive to the dangers of doing that to the degree that Kennedy was. Kennedy was no less fearful of the consequences of walking away for himself and his party than Johnson was. But I think he was more sensitive to the risks involved in a deeper military involvement than Johnson was, because he had experienced war.
I'm going to jump in with Johnson taking over in a second, but I want to widen the perspective here. And I'm going to widen it to Eisenhower, and I'm going to widen it to this past summer with Afghanistan. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I've seen what's happened to real estate there. I've seen the defense contractors. I've seen 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in America surround D.C. I can think back to this famous quote. Hopefully I won't butcher it, but Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex. Some people today might want to call that the deep state, whatnot. But then we see Afghanistan happen this summer. Is it fair for people, from your perspective, is it fair for people to be looking back to that Eisenhower quote, looking at Afghanistan right now, seeing the amount of money we put into Afghanistan, arguably Iraq as well, over multiple presidencies, Bush, Obama, Trump, now Biden, and to just be thinking that maybe the way we're looking at Vietnam has not been correct? I think instinctively this summer, most all Americans just looked at Afghanistan and said, okay, this was some kind of boondoggle where people were just getting paid, but it was never about winning. I guess for me, looking back to that famous Eisenhower quote and having me reanalyze or rethink about the Vietnam War. Is that a fair way to look at things?
My short answer to your question is yes. Now I'll give you a longer answer. We should never, ever forget that the President of the United States, in his farewell address to the American people, who warned about the military-industrial complex, was a graduate of the United States Military Academy and a retired 5-star general of the Army.
His words carry weight.
Indeed, they do. I think another thing to keep in mind is, and this is a theme that exists throughout the early chapters of my book, especially when you look at the chapters on the pigs and the missile crisis and all of the chapters on the Vietnam War, is that the constant drumbeat of the United States military during the early to mid to late 60s was the solution to problems in the world is the application of force. And if you're not turning a corner, then the solution is to apply more force. I think to some degree, it's a reflection of the influence of the, quote, military-industrial complex, but I think it's in some ways even more fundamental and scarier than that, which is if you're educated and trained in your profession to address and solve problems through the application of force, what are you going to recommend as a solution to problems? An application of force. I think to a significant degree, that was a big difference between, let's say, Kennedy and Johnson versus the uniformed military services, in particular the service chiefs. Their recommendations to Kennedy during the missile crisis were appalling. Without exception, they all pressured him to invade Cuba without thinking through the consequences of what that actually would have entailed.
It would have entailed nuclear war, most likely.
Nuclear war. They weren't sensitive to that. Kennedy and Johnson were, because their field of vision is a lot broader than simply military operations. I do think that created a significant problem when it came to American decision-making during the Vietnam War, which is you have presidents of the United States who, frankly, don't trust or respect the wisdom and judgment of the senior military leadership who are constantly telling them, use more force to solve a problem. Whereas for the military, they looked at the presidents of the United States and said they lacked steel in their backbone. That created a fundamental distrust of the other, which made both sides reluctant to be really candid with each other about what they saw as the fundamental problem. And when you don't have honest communication between the political leadership of this country and the military leadership of this country, you've got a significant problem. I do think that the influence, the, quote, military-industrial complex, unquote, that Eisenhower, a graduate of a military academy and retired 5-star general, pointed out is real. But I think some of it, too, has to do with experience and education. I think for most of the generals and admirals in the American military in the early to mid-60s, they had all been junior officers in World War II. And what that taught them at an impressionable age was pouring it on militarily will bring you victory. And they carried that lesson with them as they rose in the ranks to become senior leadership of their services. So they apply an insight and a lesson that they had learned as junior officers that they believe will be applicable to circumstances today. I think that the Vietnam War obviously had a lot of impact on a lot of different people, and we all learned far more from our failures than our successes. That includes the military. And I think it was an awakening for them. But what I'm trying to drive home to you, Mike, is I think that the senior military leadership of the United States today is a lot more broad in its thinking, more sophisticated in terms of weighing factors, much less inclined to have a knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, Mr. President, the answer to this problem is more force. I believe that if you look at the history of both Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a significant amount of resistance on the part of the uniformed services to certain steps that were taken to escalate those conflicts. The other thing is education. I mean, I've taught at the Naval Academy for 31 years. One of the primary reasons I began teaching there and have stayed there as long as I have is my belief that educating future senior military leaders of the United States to think critically, to think broadly, and to attempt wisely to prevent wars while protecting the national interest rather than merely winning them is worth my time and is serving the American people. And I do think as a result of that, collectively, the military leadership of this country since Vietnam is in a much more sophisticated and wiser place when it comes to looking at issues of war and peace.
Let me give a little pushback. If I'm thinking back to the Vietnam War, some will argue the idea of a domino theory, Some will say, no, there was never a domino theory. It was a nuclear time and domino theory was just not justified. If I roll forward back to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, me as just the outsider looking in, I say to myself, well, here I am in Saigon tonight, and I can think, well, America threw more bombs into Vietnam than, I don't know, all of World War II combined or something. We killed 4 million people indiscriminately, mostly civilians, more than likely.
And mostly South Vietnamese.
Yeah, but here's where I'm going with this is I don't think I've heard, and this is my pushback to your point about the military having perhaps a more sophisticated view. I don't know how many civilians have died in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya in the last 20, I guess, since the first Gulf War in the early 90s, in the last 40 years. I don't know how many civilians have died. I mean, is it in the millions? I'm guessing it probably is.
Too many. I take your point, Mike. I personally do not believe that resorting to force is a manifestation of success. It's a manifestation of failure. If you have to apply force to solve differences between reasoning human beings, you have failed. In that respect, to me, it's not only the last option, but it's an option that illustrates that you can't fix a problem in a more thoughtful and compassionate way. But what I'm trying to point out to you is I doubt there are very many, if any, senior military officers today who would advocate the initiation of nuclear weapons in a war. They all did during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
As a first strike, you mean?
As a first strike. Because that generation of military officers viewed nuclear weapons as bigger bombs. I think that they've become more thoughtful and sophisticated about that, and they realize that the only rational purpose for having them is to deter their use by other people. When it comes to civilian casualties, no one, I believe, understands the ugliness of war better than those who wage it. That's one of the paradoxes. I think that those who inflict suffering on other people professionally are probably more aware of the consequences of that often than those who are watching it on TV. I think, too, that the military has become super sensitive to the political consequences of indiscriminate civilian injury and death due to the application of firepower. Weapons hurt people, but to suggest that the military today isn't more sensitive and at least attempts to be more constrained in how it applies force, I think is not accurate. And I say that as someone who thinks the application of force is a manifestation of failure. They don't allow the journalists to report wars uncensored. The only uncensored war in American history was the first and last one, the Vietnam War. The military since Vietnam has refused carte blanche access to the battlefield on the part of journalists because they understand the political consequences of seeing images of destruction and suffering on TV.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably get to it in a few minutes or so, but the My Lai situation for sure. I want to keep you at the first strike thought. I don't know the answer or what I'm going to put out there on the table, but on this podcast, I had a game theorist who's in his 80s, Israeli guy, won the Nobel Prize, a guy named Robert Aumann. He made the point to me on this podcast. He said, look, was it Schellin?
Thomas Schellin.
Yes. I think they shared the prize together, actually. But essentially, and I'm reducing this, and I could be off a little bit, but the work essentially said, look, we need to have the bombers in the air 24/7 with mutually assured destruction, and that's how we win in a game theory context. I'm curious if you've seen or if you know the generals that were advocating for first strikes on Cuba. Was there any game theory there, or was it just more cowboy? Because at that point in time, once the Russians take that, because it first got the Bay of Pigs, then the Russians put the nukes in there. At the moment they put the nukes in there, it's no longer that bombers in the air 24/7 looking at each other. The other side is ramped up. So was that ramp up of the other side, were the generals applying any kind of game theory, or was it something else?
The caricature or poster boy of the generals in this case would be Curtis LeMay.
He has some quotes out there for sure. Some of his quotes are insane.
Again, I'm not an expert on Curtis LeMay, but I don't think I'm doing violence to his position when I would say that he probably considered game theory to be bullshit. From his point of view, it's all about winning wars and whatever it takes to do so. It was a very simple, unsophisticated, direct, and in the context of World War II, brutally effective way of waging war. The problem is with the existence of nuclear weapons, not only possessed by you, but your adversaries, it changes things. LeMay and his generation had not adjusted to that new reality. The other thing about game theory, and I mentioned this in the book, is Schelling's articulation of game theory is very attractive on the basis of theory, abstraction, and reason. But you're assuming in that kind of a situation that adversaries will collaborate with each other. The reality in war is that when you're hurting somebody else, they're usually not in a mood to collaborate with you. They're not going to play the game according to the rules that you've articulated. They're going to play the game of war, which is an ugly game, in their own way, from their own point of view. I think that was the fundamental flaw of game theory, which is if I transmit or signal X, my adversary is going to see that and accommodate me by replying with Y. It doesn't usually work that way, unfortunately. And I think that exposed the limitations of game theory. I think it's used quite often, even today, in the war colleges.
Maybe we got lucky during the Cold War in the sense that, because there was all kinds of accidents, there was all kinds of nuclear accidents that took place on both sides involving aircrafts and subs and whatnot. We could have easily had something that would have, quote, broke through the game theory, and there would have been somebody taking a first strike, and then we're off to the races.
Well, I mean, that's McNamara's fundamental conclusion about the missile crisis, is that we were lucky as hell that we didn't slip over the edge into a disaster because of miscalculation, misperception, etc. The thing about game theory is it's not very good at plugging into the equation fundamentals like human passion, irrationality, pressure, etc. I respect and admire decision-making based on pure reason and logic. The problem is it usually doesn't really work that way in the real world.
Fair enough. Let me take you back to 63, 64. We have this awful event. President of America is shot, and we have a new president. Most of his administration, Pentagon types, including McNamara and others, they came along for the ride, which is kind of an interesting thing. At that moment in history, with so much going on, I could try to put myself in LBJ's shoes, and I think maybe I would have wanted some continuity. I assume it was probably something along those lines. But we find ourselves in a situation where these two men, McNamara and LBJ, are now partners, and they might not have really ever picked themselves to be partners. Is that a fair assessment?
I agree with that. I think that there was a grudging mutual admiration between the two of them, though their personalities, their styles, their temperaments were fundamentally different. McNamara told me again and again that he had personal affection for John F. Kennedy in a way that he found it very difficult to connect with Lyndon Johnson. But of course, the irony is, if anything, Johnson was even more dependent on McNamara than Kennedy had been. And it illustrates how there's so many variables when it comes to understanding and explaining history. One of them is personal chemistry. But the reality was, after November 22nd of 1963, Lyndon Johnson is president of the United States. He is the one who's constitutionally charged with making these final decisions, and the people who advise him are going to do their very best to give him the best advice that they can and work with him as best as they can, even if they may not personally feel as simpatico with him as they had with Kennedy. Kennedy is gone.
Let me keep it at those two guys for a moment. I think also for me, another awakening point was watching The Fog of War, the documentary, Errol Morris's documentary, before I had picked up a lot of the LBJ biographies and whatnot. But the tapes are very difficult for me as an American, spending time living in Vietnam, seeing how I'm treated. To listen to some of those tapes, and I'm sure someone can say, well, something was out of context or whatnot. Some of them, it doesn't make a difference whether they were out of context or not. Some of the things that were said were just off the charts. And we can rationalize a lot of those things. But the tapes are just, it's not a pretty picture of decision-making, is it? And I think also not everything has been released yet.
Not everything has, but I would say most everything of substance has. It's important for listeners to understand that different presidents think through decisions in different ways. And I'm generalizing now, and there's an exception to every rule. There are three presidents who recorded a significant amount of business, quote unquote, in the White House: John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. No president with half a brain has done that ever since Watergate. Kennedy's style of decision-making tended to be based on deliberations at meetings. That's why he recorded essentially meetings. He recorded some phone conversations, but the vast majority of his recordings in the Kennedy Library today are of meetings. Johnson's style of decision-making was to talk through an issue with other people and then decide. He used the phone constantly. I would say at least 90% of all of the voluminous recordings in the Johnson Library are of telephone conversations. There are implications to that. People are going to be a lot more candid and let their hair down and be more crude over the phone than they will be in a meeting with 15 or 20 other people. I think, too, Johnson was an earthier. He was more coarse president than than Kennedy was, excuse me. His style was rough around the edges. And I think that the talk and vocabulary you hear on those tapes of phone conversations, the part of Johnson, illustrate all of these things, and they kind of speak to your point. I don't think that Johnson was any less concerned about the loss of human life than John F. Kennedy was, or frankly, even Richard Nixon. I think a lot of it, frankly, has to do with what I call the burdens and dilemma of power. When you have to make decisions at that level, as I explained to midshipmen, it's almost never a choice between the, quote, good option and the, quote, bad option. At that level, particularly if you're talking about issues of war and peace, you're almost always choosing among lesser evils, i.e., what choice am I about to make that's going to do the least damage or runs the least risk? When you combine that with the pressures on someone who sits in the Oval Office, and they know in their heart of hearts that the consequences of their decision are getting people killed, not only do they have the burden of trying to make the least bad decision or the best decision, but they're also sensitive to the fact that whatever decision they make is going to have irreversible consequences for people. They're not going to advertise that at a press conference. They're probably going to lose sleep over that at 3 o'clock in the morning, or they may whine or moan or complain to their wife or their very closest aides who they know will be discreet. But that's what I saw working with Robert McNamara and Clark Clifford, is that these are human beings at the end of the day who make these consequential decisions that affect the lives of other people. They have the strengths and weaknesses that all of us do. They may be inordinately intelligent, and I guarantee you they're inordinately ambitious, and most of them are inordinately egotistical, but they are human. That, for example, to me has always been the paradox of Robert McNamara. He projected an image throughout his time at the Pentagon and later in his life of being the uber-rational technocrat. I mean, the label was the human computer, and Halberstam carried that to the point of caricature because that was the image that he projected to the world. Well, I saw that that was part of him, but there was an equal part of him that he kept hidden from the world, which was very introspective, very emotional, very sensitive, and I assure you, he understood all too well what the human consequences were of the recommendations that he made to Johnson about the Vietnam War. I extrapolate from that, Mike. I suspect that's true of most decision makers. It's just that they're not going to advertise that part of what I call the burden of decision making to other people.
Let me raise some of the contrasts and some controversy. For me, growing up, there's no doubt that when politics was discussed, the word Nixon literally became a four-letter word. I didn't understand everything that took place given my age when Watergate went down and even into the 80s in high school and whatnot. It wasn't until much later in life that I had some perspective on it. And of course, the guy did bad things. But when one goes through the life of someone like LBJ, it's hard to go ahead and say, well, okay, here's Nixon over here on this side, and then LBJ is over here on this side. Okay, this guy Nixon was portrayed, and this is often for partisan political reasons, he's been portrayed as a really bad guy. I think what's interesting about your book is that you open up with, I believe the line is, they were not bad men. Most people, even probably people on the right, as much bad press as Nixon has got since Watergate, I think people would openly say, oh yeah, Nixon was a bad guy. May or may not be, I don't know. But for me, I have a hard time saying when I dig deep into watching what was taking place, 64 to 68, I have a hard time. You know some of these people firsthand. I've also got a perspective where I'm in that country. And so I have a hard time wrapping my arms around that I have to agree with they were not bad men when they were arguably responsible for the unnecessary deaths of millions. You see where I'm going here? It's complicated.
I do, Mike. That's the paradox. The first two sentences in my book were, they were not bad men, period. But they made some very bad decisions, period. That's a paradox. Oftentimes my students at the Naval Academy will, in typical midshipman fashion, they'll ask me to cut to the chase and tell them, what's the fundamental takeaway point from this book that you've written, Professor VanDeMark? And I have to think for a moment, but then I convey to them what I see as the essential insight of all of this tragedy. And it's this. It's not the story of bad people making bad decisions. It's much worse than that. It's much scarier than that. It's the story of good people making bad decisions. And the reason for that is you consider yourself a good person, Mike. I consider myself a good person. Most people consider themselves good people. What does that tell you? That you and I and most people are capable of making extraordinarily bad decisions with the very best of intentions. In other words, smart people can do stupid things, and good intentions can lead to suffering.
Where do we draw the line in history, though? Because I see what you're doing. Is anybody, if we start to look through the history of war and whatnot, let's just say the 20th century, there had to have been some bad people.
Oh, I understand. The implication of what you're saying is, am I arguing that Adolf Hitler was a good person? No. But I do think, and this is important, to recognize politics does not attract saints. Politics is not a saintly business. I personally have seen it up close and personal, and I find it extraordinarily forbidding and sobering. And I think to myself, I wouldn't want to have to play that game, because the compromises you have to make to get to the top are many. And then once you're there, the choices you have to make are hideous. I think that people oftentimes have a very clinical and idealized view of the way that decision-making at the highest level of politics works. It's not a pretty business, and it's not conducted by saints. And as I said before, the choices usually are really miserable. The other point I want to come back to for just a moment is that politicians, I believe, don't really grasp what they're buying into on the way up. And then they're slapped in the face once they get to the top of the greasy pole by what they have to deal with and how they have to deal with it. And I think to myself, well, I have students, for example, at the Naval Academy. Some of them are probably dreaming and scheming to become Chief of Naval Operations or maybe Secretary of Defense like Lloyd Austin, or President of the United States like Jimmy Carter, who was a Naval Academy graduate. And I tell them very honestly, I said, if you understood what is involved in terms of decisions you have to make at that level, you wouldn't dream and scheme to get there. You would run from that. But then I think to myself, well, someone has to do it. And I want the very best people to do it. Don't ask me to do it, because I understand what it entails. I saw what it did to Robert McNamara.
If I keep it at LBJ for a moment, and we're not going to repeat everything he has to say that's colorful, I've actually searched most of the biographies. It's quite amazing, actually, that a lot of the things that he said that were really raw are probably not in most of the top biographies. If you just do a search for words, I mean, a former baseball player, a catcher. I mean, I use more F-bombs than I know what to do with. I've used them occasionally on this podcast. I'm not a saint. LBJ was an especially coarse individual. I think of young people today that are leading the charge on the woke culture. I think if they did any analysis of things and actions that LBJ took, just on a personal level, some of these young people in their 20s literally might stroke out or have heart attacks if they heard what LBJ was saying.
Absolutely. In addition to that, Mike, they would also have to accompany that with the recognition and admission, and this is a paradox, that this vulgarian did more to advance the civil and political rights of African Americans than any president in history, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln.
Is that arguable?
Unquestionable.
My only pushback on that is there's no doubt that he put a lot of things in motion. There's a lot of basic rights that he helped people obtain. The part that I don't like about the Great Society is the way that the living for example, African Americans unfolded after that, which became often high rises in big cities that have really not seen the best of times since those times. The stats show this, the disintegration of the African American families. On paper, yes, the rights are there, and a lot of things ended, Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff, very important things that had to take place, and he gets the credit for that. But the way things have unfolded since then probably are not what was designed on paper.
I'm not an expert on American social policy since 1960, but I concede your point. Let's assume for the sake of argument that what you just said now is 90% right. That's probably true. But again, it illustrates a paradox. Cliche, but it happens to be true. The road to disaster is paved with what, Mike?
Good intentions.
Good intentions. Lyndon Johnson was a vulgarian. And another paradox, you could make a pretty compelling argument that he was the poster boy of the Southern white male redneck, racist. Okay, all of which may be true, and yet he was the one who, as President of the United States, got Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made the constitutional amendments passed during Reconstruction real.
Okay, let me give a little pushback and take it to 1965. With a guy like you, it's tough because you've got so much background and everything and so many books. I'm in dangerous territory to lead you around.
Every issue is debatable, Mike. There are two sides to every coin.
So here's one that really, to add fuel to the fire of this whole idea of what was going on during that time period. Rolling Thunder, troops on the ground, everything. 1965 was a really eventful year. I was completely unaware until this year. Was it this year or last year? I interviewed a guy on this podcast. He wrote a book called The Jakarta Method. I had no earthly idea how many Indonesians perished in 1965, essentially because of us. The number is arguably over 1 million. Sometimes when I hear that maybe some tapes are not available, et cetera, whatever is still not out there about JFK was being postponed due to COVID. Sometimes you just scratch your head. You're like, man, even if there's nothing there, let it out.
Of course, again, the paradox of that is those who control the access to the tapes are probably withholding X or Y out of fear that it's going to damage the image or reputation of the beloved. And it may, but the reality is it ultimately makes all of these people more human and more understandable and more complex and contradictory. Well, welcome to human nature. Kennedy was the epitome of grace, charisma, and male handsomeness. He had it all. He also personalized the consequences of the Bay of Pigs and authorized the CIA to attempt to assassinate Castro. He ran against Nixon in 1960. His father helped that process along in both West Virginia during the primaries and Illinois in the general election. It complicates him. It makes him look a little less graceful and a little less perfect and heroic, but it makes him more human because it makes him more complicated and more complex. I oftentimes do not understand why people cannot embrace complexity and contradiction. The older I get, the more I realize that most human beings are on a spectrum of gray. Very few are all white or all black. They're all varying shades of gray, or most are. You have outliers like Adolf Hitler and so forth, but you understand my point. I think historians, when they write about people or tragedies like the Vietnam War, for whatever reason, they find it oftentimes difficult to respect the reader enough to share with him or her the complexities and contradictions of those that they're writing about. The American people are not stupid. I think most politicians and political leaders underestimate both the wisdom and the compassion of the American people. When presidents do something stupid, they usually try to hide that from the American people out of a fear that they won't understand or will chastise them. When in reality, if they admit their flaws up front to the American people, they get it and will move on. Exhibit A in this regard is Bill Clinton during Monica-gate. The transgression that he committed outside of his marriage it's unfortunate. It wasn't proper, but the American people would have understood if Bill Clinton had gotten on TV and said, I made a mistake, a big one. I owe an apology to Miss Lewinsky, my wife, and you. And that's the last I'm going to say about this. That thing would have probably blown over within about a month.
But he was closer in time frame at that moment in time to Gary Hart 1988 who did not get the nomination because of a picture with another girl. So,
yeah, and he hard finessed that one too.
I mean, Clinton, if you think back in time, he was closer to that event than he is to us today, where most people today would be like, whatever.
Well, perhaps, Mike, you're right. But again, the point I'm trying to make here is that I think most political leaders, they don't trust the American people enough, that they underestimate the American people rather than overestimate them. What was P.T. Barnum's famous saying? You can fool some of the people some of the time. You can't fool all the people all the time. That is the essence of why the founding fathers put ultimate political power in the hands of the American people collectively.
Let me keep you at McNamara for a moment. 64 time period until he was let go or resigned. You'll have to tell me. Why did he not resign? So he's responsible for the Pentagon Papers. He kind of laid out this scenario for all the faults of the conflict, of the war. I shouldn't call it a conflict. It was definitely a war, of course. But why did he stay? He had this thoughtful approach. If he wasn't just doing a big CYA, I can watch Aaron Morris's film and I can say, man, some of this sounds like CYA. But why did he not resign between 64, 65, 67? Why did he not just step away?
I think it's a multiplicity of reasons. Let me address the CYA issue. If you read the memoranda that he submits to President Johnson throughout the war, the implication of that is the person who is most egregiously wrong is himself. He's the first political and military leader during the Vietnam War to admit this thing isn't working. And he's the architect of the policy. So he's not covering his ass in these memos. It's a combination of things. I think it's the compulsion on the part of overachievers to continue to work a problem that they do not want to admit to themselves is unsolvable. I think part of it is what I call the rationale of the inside player, meaning if I stay in power and keep my mouth shut publicly, I can influence the process by speaking truth to power privately, which he did. He never did it publicly. In McNamara's case, the psychological burden of his advice and the consequences of that advice in terms of human lives effectively came close to breaking him by the end of his tenure at the Pentagon. And Johnson saw that and helped him out the door. Once he left, as he told me privately, he said, I just turned off. And by that, I think what he's trying to tell me was, I did not want to go there because it was so traumatic for me as well as for many other people. And I think he regretted that for the rest of his life. He understood at least as well as everyone else that one of the first lines in his obituary would be, here was a man who said the war wasn't winnable and never went public about that after he left the Pentagon.
Did you ever have conversations with him where the topic came up of civilian deaths in Vietnam? In The Fog of War, for example, he mentions the 3.6 million figure of the number of people, the number of Vietnamese dead. But did he ever describe what they knew during that time period? Did they know how many civilians they were killing? They had to have had some idea.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is I'll illustrate it with one example, because I mentioned this in the book. McNamara forced the uniformed military to factor into their recommendations concerning bombing operations the probable number of civilian casualties that would result therefrom. Until he forced them to do that, the uniformed military never included in their bombing recommendations what the civilian casualties would be as a result of those operations. He forced them to do that. I mean, the implications, Mike, are he understood very well that innocents are going to get hurt by these policies. And yet he's going to be a participant in choosing these policies. I think that's partly what created the cognitive dissonance and psychological burden on him that nearly broke him at the end. I mean, he got it, Mike, is what I'm trying to convey to you and other people. I mean, he wasn't stupid.
No, I'm sure from an IQ and an academic standpoint, he probably truly was the best and the brightest.
Well, that's what's so scary.
A lot of his decisions clearly did not look like the best and the brightest.
No. In fact, they look grievously poor. Like I tell my students, and I'm blunt with them. I said, look, you're the best and the brightest today. You are patriotic. You are well-intentioned. You have a high IQ. You love this country. You are capable of making stupendously bad decisions that will hurt an awful lot of people and damage the country you love.
I guess the part that is so difficult for me being in Vietnam is those just absolute numbers and the contrast. You knew, of course, you've been involved in understanding for a long time, but I think if we were to ask the average American today, and of course, young people are going to have no clue. They're not going to even know the names of the presidents. Your students will, but other young people won't.
No, the Vietnam War is the Peloponnesian War to college.
But I mean, if we were to ask the average American that's of age to even know, my parents, 78, 80, they don't know this 3.6 million Vietnamese died. They don't have this contrast in their mind of we killed 4 million. We have a wall on the mall in DC that honors 58,000. And me being a little bit of a skeptic, a little bit of an instigator, I asked when I took a then Vietnamese fiance to DC, we went to the wall and I asked very nicely, I wasn't being a jerk, but I said, is there anywhere here that says we killed 4 million Vietnamese? You've never seen a park ranger run faster away from me, reminding me that it was a wall to honor Americans. And in talking with you, the hardest part of living here is to realize the difference in deaths. In many ways, it wasn't a war. We had put together the South. There would not be a South Vietnam without America. So was it really a civil war or was it just us here? A lot of questions in there.
Well, I'll just mention a few things, Mike. If you divide 3.5 million by 58,000, you get 60.34. The death rate of the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War was 60 times that of the Americans.
It's unfathomable.
Now, in addition to that, here we go. The American people, bless their heart, are, I believe, a big-hearted, open, well-intentioned group of people, as good a group of people as you're going to find on this planet of ours. And yet, it's always all about us all the time. And the final thing I would point out is, do you think Americans today have any clue as to the magnitude of civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I don't think it's even been publicized.
That says something too.
Where's the media on this? Where's the Bernstein and Woodward? Where are those guys today? Where's the millions in Iraq that probably died and no one knows?
My personal opinion about the media is it's better to have a free media than not have one. That having been said, the media gives people what they want because they exist to make a profit. They tell the American people and they concentrate on the things the American people want. I'll never forget something Clark Clifford once told me. He said, Brian, if I was the publisher of a newspaper and all I published in that newspaper were good stories about the bright side of human nature, no one would buy the paper. But if I publish a paper that is all about the dark side of human nature, I can't print enough copies for people to buy. What does that reveal?
100%. In your conversations with McNamara, and again, I can think back to the Fog of War documentary. And when he came to Vietnam, I guess for the first time, like 95, I think.
Well, since the war, he made 7 or 8 trips there during the war. But
since the war. He met with, was it Giap? I'm not sure which general.
Yes.
Okay. And the idea, and he paraphrased what the Vietnamese general was saying to him, which was, didn't you understand us? You know, we fought the Chinese for 1,000 years. Of course, McNamara was not editing that film, so it was cut off brief there. He didn't really give a perspective on what the general said. He didn't say, oh, yeah, I knew that or I didn't know that. But I've kind of already asked you this a little bit already, but I thought that was a fascinating exchange because the implication was the way that Morris edited that film is that McNamara had no idea, which is probably not accurate.
I'll answer it this way, Mike. McNamara's knowledge and understanding of Vietnamese history and culture escalated exponentially after the war. His sensitivity to that dimension of the problem escalated exponentially after the war. That having been said, is that unusual? Do you think that George W. Bush was an expert on Iraq in 2003? Do you think the people around him were an expert on Iraq and were sensitive to Iraqi history and culture? No. It happens again and again and again. We become experts on a topic once we're knee deep in the muddy, and the horse had been out of the barn for years.
That's true. Again, I look at my personal situation. I mean, come on, you would not expect some guy that's writing investment books to be having this conversation with you. I'm clearly not as versed and rehearsed as you, and I've not put in the work as you, but I'm able to carry on a conversation to some extent.
Absolutely.
Because I've jumped into the molasses in the country.
And it's true, Mike, that old saying, the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know. There's a lot about Vietnam and the Vietnam War I don't know. And my awareness of that has increased over the years as I've learned more and more.
Can I share with you something interesting? A friend of mine came here a couple years ago. He was actually an Olympic swimming champion, won a couple gold medals back in the 80s. He had been reading about where the last helicopter took off, the famous picture. It was actually on top of where the CIA had top of the building had their headquarters. Well, this building is still here in Saigon. My friend went there, but I had not been there by myself. So I walked over one day and I knew roughly where it was. And there's some security guards sitting downstairs and I gave him $20 and he's like, go on upstairs. So I took the elevator. It was this really nice elevator in an old building and you go up and I'm all by myself and I get off at like the 9th floor. You walk up 2 flights of stairs and wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. I'm standing there looking at that helipad and across the street is a 15-story glistening mall. And I'm sitting there looking at that helipad that nobody is thinking about except for some random American who's just sitting there looking at history.
That speaks volumes about 2 things. The burning impression that Vietnam made on Americans that persists even half a century after we left. The fact that life goes on, people move on, and those who were affected most intimately by the war, the Vietnamese themselves, have frankly done a better job of moving on than we have.
100%.
They won and we lost. And it's a hell of a lot easier to process a victory than it is a defeat.
Have you had a chance to experience Vietnam yet?
One opportunity I had was a very important one. McNamara invited me to go with him to Hanoi. And I thought it over, and I eventually told him no. There were 2 reasons why. One was helping him write his book. I had accomplished what I sought to accomplish, which was to get him, the primary architect of this war, on the record about the war, even 3.5 decades later. The other factor is a little more personal, and that is, this is 1995. I was an untenured professor of history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, where a lot of the officers there at the time had served in Vietnam, for whom Vietnam was a very, very, very personal and emotional issue. I felt that I had probably strained that welcome mat enough by having helped McNamara that I didn't want to strain it further by traveling with him to Hanoi and ginning up anger and resentment about him and therefore me even more because I was vulnerable. I had no tenure. That's a long time ago now.
Fair point, though. I can understand that.
Yeah. I mean, McNamara is still a dirty word in military circles.
Is Vietnam still a dirty word?
I think most people in the military prefer not to go there. The reason is not very complex. I'm just expressing an opinion now. I think that the American experience in Vietnam is a vivid illustration of the limitations of military power and the brutal consequences of good intentions. If you're wearing the uniform of the United States, why would you want to go there?
On the flip side, if people can put some of that aside, we haven't talked about it, but I'm a pretty normal guy. I might be the only one that could have this conversation with you living here right now, because there's not that many Americans living here, relatively speaking. Maybe for corporate America, I'm just kind of random. I can live anywhere I want in the world. I choose to live here. So there you go. But it's an amazing experience. I think if Americans had the opportunity, it's so far away, 8,000 miles, but if you've got the opportunity to grab your bucket list trip or whatever, I can just tell you it's a really, really amazing place.
It's the top of my travel list. One of the things that's so moving to me, Mike, is that I've seen veterans of the Vietnam War for whom the war was a ghost, monkey on their back for decades, return to Vietnam as older men. What just shakes them to their foundation is the warmth and compassion that they receive from the Vietnamese people, even once they know that they were talking to people who had been American soldiers in the war. I think that's extraordinary. It shows how generous the people the Vietnamese are, and it helps heal a wound. for those who had served in the war. I don't remember the exact quote now, but I mentioned in the book, there are no unwounded soldiers in a war. They may be those who are not physically wounded, but it usually has the effect of inflicting emotional and psychological wounds on those who are not physically wounded. A trip to Vietnam is a cathartic experience for a lot of these guys because they are accepted and their humanity is accepted by people for whom they were at war 40 or 50 years ago. And I think that's a beautiful thing for both the Vietnamese and for them.
I truly still do not understand exactly. You make the point, okay, yes, part of it is commerce and very smart business people here in Vietnam, but there is another aspect to it. I still do not understand the affection completely. If you're an American, you come to Vietnam, the affection towards you is off the charts. If you are an Australian, okay, it's okay. If you're a Russian, then maybe it's okay. But if you're American, I still don't understand it. And I'm American and I'm here.
Well, Mike, I'm going to be a little sarcastic. It's not complicated. They know what we know, which is we are a big-hearted, friendly, compassionate people. It's written all over our face and our gestures, and I think they feel that. But again, I'm into paradoxes. The paradox of that and the destruction wrought on that country by people like us. I never get over that paradox. And it just keeps bringing me back to that fundamental point that I've made again and again, which is the road to disaster is often paved with good intentions, and good people can make super bad decisions. If people really internalize that, it's not going to eliminate the making of bad decisions. That will never happen. The self-awareness will reduce the likelihood that you will make those kind of bad decisions when you realize that you're capable of making them, which is yet another paradox.
I think the most complicated aspect of your work for me, and of course, I read the one sentence. I said they were not bad men. And you said, okay, but there's a second part, it was about the bad decisions. That opening sentence is so complicated because
it goes against the grain.
It is your point of view too.
Yes. Well, I knew these people. See, that's another thing. They both let me get close to them. Clark Clifford and Robert McNamara let me get close to them. I saw their humanity. In McNamara's case, I saw the humanity of the individual who contributed in significant ways to the making of decisions that led to the deaths of millions of innocent people.
And if somebody wanted to get into a hard-charging argument with you, I'm just putting out there for being devil's advocate, that somebody could argue, and I brought up the Indonesia issue in 1965, millions upon millions upon millions of people killed, and 58,000 Americans dead, that somebody could apply some religious terminology to this and say, well, gosh, these decisions and these acts, would somebody be out of their mind to say, well, gosh, this sure seems evil?
Not in the least. And I think Robert McNamara understood that.
He had to live with that.
He had to live with it.
It's tough stuff.
It is. Politics is not a Sunday school exercise, Mike. It's back to that point I made before. I think politics is inherently corrupting. It's inherently messy, and it compels choices that entail evil. But let me just say a final thing in closing. I'm just going to make a point here. Decision-making at the highest levels of government, especially regarding national security issues, often pose sobering moral and ethical quandaries that are rooted in choosing not the, quote, right answer, but the, quote, lesser evil among greater evils. And I'll give you two examples. President Truman and his advisors doing evil by targeting non-combatants in Tokyo through firebombing, the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to do good, which was to victoriously end a bloody war against Japan. President Johnson and his advisors risking and sacrificing lives, a lot of lives, Vietnamese and American, in pursuit of American objectives, all with uncertain prospects of success. I think these examples illustrate a fundamental but disconcerting truth, which is those who make decisions regarding war and peace rarely know all the relevant facts and cannot predict the outcome of their choices with certainty. Yet their choices certainly impact the lives of many people, often irreversibly. They and those whose lives they affect must live with the consequence of their decisions, which become clear only in hindsight.
Can I ask you one more? Because you brought the idea of nuclear weapons in Japan up. I don't want to keep you going, but how close did we get to using nuclear weapons in Vietnam?
Not at all, because of elected civilian political leaders understood the folly and insanity of that, unlike senior military officers. Bless their heart, founding fathers understood that the perspective of an elected political leader was far different, far broader than those in uniform. And I'm not casting aspersions on the patriotism of those who wear the uniform. I've spent 30 years educating people who wear the uniform, but their perspective is different. It's narrower. And in the context of the use of nuclear weapons, there's far more wisdom that's possessed by political leadership because of their perspective.
It's got to be a much interesting conversation these days in teaching at a place like the Naval Academy, when in the old days, you had the two superpowers kind of faced off. Now, you got Pakistan, you got China. I mean, I'm sure Israel has nukes. There's probably a few states out there that we don't know about, or America has nukes in a few states that we don't know about, a la Turkey back in the day. It's a much more complicated place than the two-actor situation, huh?
Yes, indeed. I'll mention here something McNamara once told me, and it's very, very sobering to contemplate. He said, Brian, contemplate this. The indefinite existence of nuclear weapons, meaning they will never be uninvented. You're never going to put that back in Pandora's box. They're around forever. Combine that with the fallibility of human nature.
We know what that means, yes, for sure.
It may take 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. But at some point, there's going to be a catastrophic joining of thermonuclear weapons and human fallibility.
It's a great ending place. It's a great place for people to think about. It's a terribly big point. People might really have to kind of sit down on the sofa and really ponder it, but I think it's hard to argue with it. I mean, how can you argue with that?
Well, just look at the parade of wars throughout human history, Mike. I don't think human nature has changed very much in the last several tens of thousands of years.
Hey, I appreciate you taking some time and wandering around with, I don't know if you had any idea what to expect with me.
It's been a very stimulating conversation. And I also appreciate the fact that you're willing to ask tough questions and pose, as you pointed out, the devil's advocate point of view. And I think that's useful because that allows people to see both sides of a coin. And life has taught me that every coin has two sides to it. And I wish the American people could remember that when they start demonizing each other over political issues today.
Yes, we're not a great place right now, but that's for another conversation. One of the books, and you'll have to rattle off others, but one of them, I'm looking at the cover right now, Road to Disaster, A New History of America's Descent into Vietnam. This is the one that starts with They Were Not Bad Men that we've been talking about, but there are many other books. Brian, where can we send people that can find you at the Naval Academy? They can find your books on Amazon. Is there a website you want to direct people to?
I would just urge them to read the books. If they wish to purchase them, wonderful. If they want to borrow them from a library, that's also fine. There's no greater flattery that you can bestow upon an author than to devote your precious time to reading what he or she has to say. And when that's done, hearing from readers. I deeply enjoy and appreciate hearing from readers in terms of how they react to what I've written. They're available through publishers, through Amazon, through Barnes & Noble, etc. But if you give me the privilege of your time, I would appreciate that. And if you write me after that, I would appreciate that even more.
I'm very similar in a way that feedback is the best thing, right? When people tell you something, they usually say something you're not expecting. It just changes everything. I love it.
And life is short, Mike. And for someone to devote hours of their life to reading what you've written is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, Brian, I appreciate you coming on again. And please keep me posted on new books because you're not going to stop writing them.
All right. On one condition. The next time you find yourself in this neck of the woods, will you look me up?
I'm trying to get there for December. And one of my best friends lives in Annapolis. I'm not sure where you live, probably close to Annapolis.
Just across the Bay Bridge.
So yeah, maybe we'll catch up for a sandwich or something over the holidays, perhaps, if you're around.
I hope so. You bet. Take care, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.